You know, we're basically trained from childhood to look at history like it's an accounting ledger.
Right, just a clean column of dates?
Exactly, dates on one side and then, treaties, battles, and regime changes on the other. Your textbook points to this jagged white line on a timeline and says, well, here's the cause and here's the effect.
It's presented as something totally engineered, like it's either broken or not broken.
Yeah, but that creates this really comforting illusion of predictability.
Mm.
And when you step back and actually try to map the invisible forces that built this hyper-connected, incredibly volatile reality you wake up to every single day,
The ledger just completely falls apart.
it really does. You realize you're looking at this landscape of muddy waters where, absolutely nothing happens in a vacuum.
Totally.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today's mission is to navigate those muddy waters. We're exploring a massive compilation of historical analysis from parts 2 and 3 of Reading Modern History Without a Map.
And just to be clear, the goal here isn't to memorize dates.
No, not at all. We want to dissect the mechanics of modernization, imperialism, mass media, and globalization. We're trying to understand the actual underlying architecture of the modern world.
Because to do that, it requires looking at history not as, isolated events, but as a complex system of overlapping pressures.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the system you and I live in right now, we really have to look at the first time a hyper-connected global system catastrophically failed.
Right, jumping back to the early 20th century.
Yeah, so industrialization had basically handed European empires this terrifying, unprecedented level of power.
Which fundamentally altered how international relations worked. I mean, you had this environment running incredibly hot on imperialism and militarism.
Governments were just violently competing for colonial resources, right, to feed those industrial engines.
Exactly. All while feeling this immense domestic pressure to project absolute strength at home.
We always hear that powder keg analogy for the start of World War I, but looking at the mechanics of the alliance system in the text, it operated much more like a modern financial derivatives market.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right, because you had this incredibly complex, opaque web of defense treaties. It's like, think of a group of mountain climbers tied together on a slippery cliff.
Yeah, so if one slips...
Everyone goes down. When one localized asset defaulted, which in this case was Austria-Hungary reacting to the assassination in Sarajevo, it triggered this cascading margin call across the whole continent.
Because no one could isolate the damage. They were systemically bound to just drag each other right into the abyss.
And once that system collapsed, the text points out that the nature of warfare itself permanently mutated.
This was the birth of total war.
Right, because historically conflicts were, somewhat contained. It was professional armies maneuvering out on battlefields.
But total war completely erased the boundary between the soldier and the civilian.
The logistics just demanded it. You can't wage an industrialized war without consuming the entire national economy.
The home front literally became the primary engine of the conflict. Governments had to take total control over food supplies with rationing. They enforced heavy censorship just to keep morale from tanking.
And millions of women were absorbed into the workforce, right? Mass-producing munitions.
Exactly. The factory worker was suddenly just as critical to the state's survival as the infantryman in the trench.
But the structural strain of that total mobilization was so huge that it shattered empires from the inside out. Look at Russia.
Yeah, the sheer logistical friction of trying to fight a mechanized war while feeding an empire, it just completely broke the Tsar's infrastructure.
Which created the vacuum for the Russian Revolution in 1917. The state collapsed, the Bolsheviks seized power, pulled Russia out of the war, and built a whole new socialist state.
And that singular logistical failure didn't just redraw borders. It birthed a global ideological framework that pitted capitalism against socialism for the rest of the century.
Wow, yeah. And then, when the physical fighting of World War I finally stopped, the attempt to build this new world order at Versailles revealed a massive blind spot.
The League of Nations and all that.
Right. The architects of the peace introduced this concept of national self-determination. The idea that people should dictate their own political sovereignty.
But that concept functioned essentially like a gated community.
Oh, totally. Self-determination was applied to fractured European empires, but it was aggressively denied to colonized peoples in Asia and Africa.
Which naturally triggered a profound geopolitical backlash.
Yeah, the text notes how this failure sparked massive anti-colonial uprisings, like the March 1st movement in Korea, where millions mobilized against Japanese colonial rule.
And the May 4th movement in China, which was driven by sheer outrage over imperial territories just being casually traded away at the peace table.
What's fascinating here is, wait, I stole your catchphrase.
No, go ahead. What's fascinating here is the timeless mechanical lesson Versailles provides. Ending combat operations and actually engineering a sustainable peace are two entirely different disciplines.
Right.
If a treaty silences the guns but deliberately leaves the underlying architecture of imperial exploitation intact, it is simply scheduling the next war.
That is such a heavy point. But okay, let's pivot slightly because that total mobilization we discussed created a fatal paradox for the state.
How so?
Well, you can't ask millions of ordinary citizens, laborers, women, colonial subjects, to physically build and sustain a global war machine and then expect them to just quietly surrender their leverage when the war ends.
Ah, right. They realized they were the true engine of the nation.
Exactly. This ushers in the age of mass society.
The masses demanded a return on their sacrifice. This era saw a huge surge in universal suffrage movements, labor unions striking for humane hours, and women demanding fundamental legal equality.
But wait, I have a question here. If the masses realize their leverage and political participation is expanding, shouldn't the mechanics of power decentralize?
You would think so.
Right. Why does this exact historical moment birth the most concentrated totalitarian fascist regimes in human history? Shouldn't more democracy mean more peace?
Well, because expanding political participation simultaneously expands elite anxiety.
Ah.
When the masses gain a voice, the state immediately searches for new mechanisms of control. The text gives a great example with Japan's Taisho democracy.
Oh, right. In 1925.
Yeah. The government passes universal male suffrage, which is a huge triumph for mass society. But in that exact same year, that same government passes the Peace Preservation Law.
Which was explicitly designed to criminalize and crush radical political dissent.
Exactly. Democratic participation and authoritarian suppression rose in tandem just to manage the volatility of this newly empowered public.
Because the elites were terrified of what a mobilized public could do to the market. I mean, consider the 1918 rice riots in Japan. You had this uprising led primarily by women protesting the artificial inflation of food prices. It proved that unorganized, ordinary people could completely paralyze the economic system.
And that volatile public was suddenly connected by this revolutionary new neurological network mass media.
Newspapers, cinema, radio.
Right, they created a synchronized public sphere. Millions of people were suddenly capable of receiving the same information and feeling the exact same emotional resonance at the exact same second.
Which brings us to the mechanics of fascism. Because you have the 1929 stock market crash.
The Great Depression.
Yeah, and it didn't just erase wealth. It vaporized global economic trust. Nations panicked. They raised tariffs and fractured the world into isolated bloc economies, basically walling off global trade to protect their own empires.
And in an environment defined by mass unemployment and starvation, fascism offered a brutal, structural promise of order.
Fascist movements didn't just take power by force, did they?
No, they exploited that severe economic anxiety using the unmediated intimacy of mass media. They weaponized the radio.
Because mass media is essentially a neutral tool.
Precisely. The same radio that connects a nation allows a dictator to bypass traditional civic institutions. They could speak directly into the living rooms of millions, bypassing critical thinking to activate primal fears.
So they used carefully engineered rallies, cinema, and radio broadcasts to manufacture extreme nationalism and violently scapegoat minorities.
They used the emotional synchronicity of the masses to convince those same masses to dismantle their own freedoms.
That is a terrifying sequence. And ultimately, fascism and the catastrophic violence of World War II completely shattered the physical and economic capacity of the old imperial powers.
Which sets the stage for the next major shift.
Right. In the aftermath, the colonized world finally forcefully seized the self-determination they had been promised and denied at Versailles. The era of decolonization officially begins.
And the newly formed United Nations Charter, with its emphasis on fundamental human rights, provided a globally recognized legal language for these anti-colonial movements.
But the physical borders of these new sovereign states were just structural nightmares.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like an outgoing landlord aggressively drawing new property lines right through the middle of existing living rooms and shared kitchens.
Yeah, trying to jam puzzle pieces together from completely different boxes.
Exactly. Forcing deeply distinct ethnic and religious groups into singular artificial states.
The friction generated by those artificial borders is just immeasurable. The text highlights India achieving independence in 1947 and how the subsequent partition caused one of the largest, most violent mass migrations in human history.
And in Indonesia, independence required a brutal armed conflict against Dutch forces who were trying to reclaim their pre-war colonies.
Yet, despite all that violence, by 1955 you have the Bandung Conference.
Right, bringing together newly independent Asian and African nations, really showcasing a new multipolar world.
But drawing a new flag doesn't magically rewrite the economic code of a country.
No, it doesn't. These newly independent nations, what we call the Global South, found themselves trapped in neo-colonialism.
They had political independence, sure, but their economies were still entirely structured around exporting cheap raw materials to the industrialized North.
They lacked infrastructure.
Exactly. You see the most complex manifestation of this border drawing and resource extraction in the Middle East.
Yeah, after the Ottoman Empire collapsed, British and French Mandate authorities carved the territory into artificial administrative zones.
And then they found oil.
Right. Immense oil reserves, which transformed those artificial zones into the primary chessboard of the Gold War.
And the consequences of those lines define the geopolitical reality of today.
They really do. And the text delves into how this shaped the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And to be strictly impartial here, just reporting what the source material lays out for Israelis, 1948 represents independence, self-determination, and survival in the wake of the Holocaust.
Right.
But for Palestinians, the text notes that that exact same year represents dispossession, displacement, and the catastrophic loss of their homeland.
The source is very clear that both the Israeli civilian need for security against attack and the Palestinian experience of occupation and displacement are bedrock historical realities.
You cannot understand the modern Middle East without holding both of those realities neutrally, exactly as the text attempts to convey them, to see the historical roots of the conflict.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, resources, religion, ethnicity, or even borders rarely detonate into war spontaneously.
Right.
They become explosive when they are catalyzed by severe economic disparity, unaddressed historical grievances, and continuous foreign intervention.
So as the Cold War exhaustively winds down and the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, the world faces a critical juncture.
We didn't fragment into isolated bloc economies like we did in the 1930s.
No, instead, the global architecture rapidly integrates. Market economies spread across former socialist states. The internet lays down this digital nervous system. We enter the era of globalization.
The deliberate integration of global markets was really an engineered defense mechanism against another world war.
Like the European Union.
Exactly. The logic was that if you weave national economies tightly together, sharing coal, steel, currency, military conflict becomes mutual economic suicide.
So what does this all mean? How did we end up in a world where a product is designed in one country, assembled in another, and sold everywhere?
Well, globalization created a hyper-optimized global supply chain. It allowed the frictionless movement of people, capital, information, and goods.
Which drove down the cost of consumer goods exponentially.
Yes, but extreme optimization requires eliminating redundancies. When you remove the friction, you also remove the shock absorbers.
We engineered a system with literally zero slack.
Zero.
The 2008 global financial crisis proved that. Obscure, complex financial instruments in the U.S. housing market collapsed, and because global capital was so intertwined, it instantly triggered worldwide unemployment.
And we experienced the exact same fragility during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, a biological vulnerability traveled the exact same logistical arteries used for global trade.
It exposed profound structural inequalities. It created this massive digital divide between populations who could transition to remote work and the essential workers physically tethered to collapsing supply chains.
Globalization brought us closer together, but it proved that global interdependence doesn't equate to shared prosperity. It equates to shared vulnerability.
Yeah, that's perfectly put.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The technological architecture of globalization, the internet, data networks, was initially viewed as this utopian tool for connection.
But today, that exact architecture is the primary geopolitical battlefield.
Right. The definition of national security radically mutated after the 9/11 attacks. It wasn't just about armies crossing physical borders anymore.
Security became about tracking non-state actors, analyzing massive data flows, and defending civilian infrastructure from cyber activity.
And even when traditional kinetic land wars do occur, their ripple effects are instantly globalized. Look at the Russia-Ukraine war. Again, staying strictly impartial and citing the text, a sovereign state was invaded, which fundamentally challenged international law. But the shockwaves didn't stop at the border.
The source notes that the conflict instantly severed critical global arteries for grain, fertilizer, and energy markets.
It demonstrates how a regional kinetic war immediately translates into a global systemic crisis because the systems cannot be decoupled.
Exactly, which is why climate change isn't just an environmental hazard, it's a systemic threat multiplier,
It dictates agricultural yields, which dictates food security.
which drives the mass displacement of climate refugees, which then destabilizes geopolitical borders. Everything overlaps.
And addressing that systemic threat requires immense computational power. This is what drives the defining arms race of the 21st century, AI and semiconductors.
Advanced microchips are literally the physical bottleneck for digital supremacy. They're the oil of the modern economy.
You can't train an AI model without thousands of these advanced chips. And sure, AI can revolutionize medical research and optimize energy grids, but it also requires staggering amounts of electricity.
Not to mention, it poses huge threats to data privacy and can automate the spread of misinformation.
And the physical fabrication of these semiconductors is concentrated in just a few highly vulnerable geographic hubs.
So 21st century problems are completely systemic. You can't solve the climate crisis without fundamentally rewriting energy policy. You can't rewrite energy policy without advanced AI. And you can't run AI without securing semiconductor supply chains.
Okay, so with all these overlapping massive global issues, how does an individual process this without succumbing to complete paralysis? How do we actually use history to judge the present rather than just memorizing depressing facts?
Well, the author of our source text uses a really beautiful metaphorical framing device for this. It's a short story about a student named Mina Sato.
Right, Mina is looking at the standard, rigid timeline for a school exhibition, and she's feeling totally alienated by the clinical ledger of wars and dates.
But then she finds a mysterious card that reads, "Before dawn, a timeline is not a line."
And the timeline basically becomes this magical, multidimensional, glowing path. Mina encounters the people living in the silent margins of those major dates.
She meets a tired factory girl inhaling the exhaust of the Industrial Revolution,
She sees a woman desperately holding bread during a civil revolution.
and an elderly woman carrying a lunchbox who represents all the varied, painful psychological weight of World War II.
Mina realizes that history isn't just clean dates on a page. Her teacher, Mr. Arai, helps her see that understanding history really means asking who pays the cost.
This raises an important question about how we consume information today. Mina's final revelation is that to understand history, you have to listen to the people who are not in the room.
You have to analyze the silences. Whenever someone says progress, the immediate required response has to be, progress for whom?
Exactly. History teaches us to look at the collateral damage behind the milestones.
So let's look at the journey we just mapped today. We started with the industrial engines of total war that broke empires.
We analyzed how mass societies' rise led to mass media being weaponized by fascism.
We looked at the volatile borders drawn during decolonization, and then the hyper-connected yet fragile architecture of globalization.
And finally, the new digital and systemic battlegrounds of the 21st century AI and climate change.
Which brings us back to the reality you and I are sitting in right now. Today, we are generating more data, more digital exhaust, and more recorded transactions than any generation in the entire history of the human species.
We are building the most detailed timeline ever constructed.
So here's a thought to leave you with. 100 years from now, when future students look back at our hyper-documented era, what profound silences will they find buried in our endless mountains of data? What invisible costs of our modern convenience are we actively failing to record? And ultimately, how will future generations judge the systemic choices we are making at this very second?